Hello and welcome back to Foreign Correspondents. I'm Sami Sorang, and joining me in the studio is our panel of foreign journalists. Welcome to the program.
Good to be back.
Thank you for being here. In recent years, social media platforms have become a popular source of news as they allow for the rapid circulation of information and the easy gathering of user opinions. However, social media as a news provider has also revealed its dark side, as in the propagation of fake news. So on this week's edition of Foreign Correspondents, we discuss the various pros and cons of social media platforms as a news provider, as well as the future of journalism in the age of social media. Okay, so let's begin our discussion today with the issue of fake news. It's been dominating the headlines. It comes in many different shapes and forms and is often circulated through social media platforms and mobile messenger apps. Fabian, could you give us some examples of fake news that you've encountered on social media?
I mean, Germany, almost all fake news are about refugees, about the Muslim community. I can give you one headline. It said, a small German boy got beaten up by refugees because of his blue eyes, something like that. Totally fabricated stories. Also in my reporting, I encounter fake news. For example, when you still remember that story that Kim Jong-un's uncle was fed to 120 dogs. That was actually started by a Chinese blogger, but actually almost all big mainstream media, they took over that story, and months later it was revealed, of course, it was a fake news story.
Right.
But then it was already forgotten and nobody really talked about it.
Right. Frank, what kind of stories have you come across?
Well, similar to Fabian, there was also the story out of North Korea. A lot of the stories that we've seen on fake news have been kind of pushed here in South Korea by ultra-conservatives.
대전에서 어린 자식들을 홀로 키우던 한 50대 여성이 최저임금 인상으로 인해서 식당에서 일자리를 잃고 생활고를 비관한 나머지 스스로 목숨을 끊었다는 그런 정말 안타까운 소식이 하나 있습니다.
존경하는 의원님께서 하신 그 대전의 그 아주머니 최저임금 자살 그 기사도 지금 가짜뉴스로 판명이 난 상태거든요.
There's also the case of something about everybody wanting to have haircuts similar to Kim Jong-un in North Korea.
Right.
And I think the case of the fake news produced out of North Korea is that the producers of that fake news kind of have some cover. There's nobody that can be checked with to determine whether that news is true or false, and there's a ready audience for that news here in South Korea.
Yeah, it's harder to check the veracity of news coming out from there. Kelly, fake news has certainly played a big part in politics in the US. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the United States during the 2016 presidential election, it was found that there were actually thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Russian bots, dispatching anti-democratic, aka anti-Hillary Clinton news, as well as news that favors the Trump administration. And that's a really dangerous example because it means that, a foreign government might have, swayed public opinion during an election.
Right, so it had big consequences there. Now, fake news can be defined as news with falsehoods that deliberately try to mislead the consumer. But there are also stories that are grounded on facts but are distorted to serve a particular motive. So Frank, where do you draw the line between fake news and a political slant, and also fake news and just sloppy journalism, honest mistakes?
I think that you need to draw it with the facts, and whether there are facts or fictions or falsehoods that are propagated in the news item, and whether it's a determined, deliberate misrepresentation of facts in order to pursue and purvey a particular bias. And I think most times when we're talking about fake news, we're talking about misleading information that's trying to get across a certain particular message to a certain audience, or sway an audience in a certain direction, in particular to vote in the 2016 election. That's a perfect example. But there's a big difference, I think, between honest errors of fact and somebody that's misleading news consumers by using falsehoods and providing really just a very slanted perspective of events.
So verifiable falsehoods and also the intent.
Yes.
Well, this is what the South Korean government is doing to tackle fake news. At a cabinet meeting on October 2nd, South Korean Prime Minister Lee Na-kyun ordered government officials to tackle the spread of fake news.
가짜뉴스가 창궐합니다. 유튜브, SNS 등 온라인에서 의도적이고 악의적인 가짜뉴스가 급속히 번지고 있습니다. 개인의 사생활이나 민감한 정책 현안은 물론 남북관계를 포함한 국가 안보나 국가 원수와 관련된 턱없는 가짜뉴스까지 나놉니다. 검찰과 경찰은 유관기관 공동 대응체계를 구축해서 가짜뉴스를 신속히 수사하고 불법은 엄정히 처벌하시기 바랍니다.
And South Korea's ruling party also drafted a new bill that would outlaw the distribution of fake news.
가짜뉴스를 제조하는 것, 제작하는 것뿐만이 아니라 그것을 유통시키는데 아무런 책임을 느끼지 않고 그냥 상업적으로 오히려 악용하고 있는 그런 유통업체에 대해서 강력하게 제재를 하자는 거죠.
What are some of the biggest dangers, the pitfalls of fake news?
Well, we've seen in the United States that fake news has the potential to mobilize people to do very bad things, right? So, for example, there's a fake news story about the Democratic Party and a supposed child sex trafficking ring. And the story said that there's a pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C. that was involved with this. And what ended up happening was a man from, I believe, North Carolina came along with a gun to investigate it himself and really scared a lot of people. So it's a prime example of something that would normally be ridiculous, really, creating a dangerous incident in the United States.
He actually shot up that restaurant. He didn't injure anybody, but he shot up that restaurant, and it became known as, I think, Pizzagate.
Pizzagate,
it was called.
I mean, that's a very extreme case, but in general, I would say that the social cohesion that we have in societies really gets lost through fake news. I mean, it very polarizes people. It spreads populism. I would explicitly say right-wing populism, and it plays with the fears of the people. And so actually I'm very worried about fake news because what it does to our society, I think the development is just starting now, and it also undermines the trust that we had in media, also in public institutions.
Right.
And yeah, that's a really alarming development.
Right.
I think it also further enforces the media bubble that we've all sort of created for ourselves in the internet era and deepened that even further. Back 30 years ago, people received their news from many fewer sources.
Sure.
So everybody had a kind of common understanding of the facts.
Right.
That's changed now through the internet, and then it's getting even more so with, again, mostly conservative-driven, media-biased news reporting that's spread through fake news.
Right. So we've mentioned conservative parties as potentially an origin of these fake news, but what about other sources of fake news?
I think there are examples of fake news that kind of fuel a political agenda, such as in the United States at least, there's a lot of race baiting fake news. I'll give you one example. As a Korean American, there was a story a while back, maybe 1 or 2 years ago, about a Korean grandmother who was supposedly beaten up in the street. And this person, supposedly said all these racial epithets towards her. And this was trending on Twitter for a while. But it actually turned out when I called the LAPD that was not the case at all. There was a woman that was injured, but there was no record of it being a hate crime or any such things in the police report.
I think that's a really good point, the danger that there is with fake news. There was in Quebec City, Canada, there was a gun attack at a mosque. And the police initially arrested a member of the mosque, a Muslim, and questioned that person. And it spread on news and on SNS and fake news that that person had committed the crime, that it was a Muslim, a so-called false flag or something like that, but that it was a Muslim that had committed the crime. And then later it was found out that it was a right-wing person that had committed the crime that also, ironically, received and consumed a lot of their news information on conservative websites, fake news propagating websites, and through SNS.
Right.
So that just gave you a depth of the scope of the problem.
Well, I would argue that fake news sources can also be state organs. I mean, for
Sure.
example, to some degree, they are also sources of fake news because they frame things in a certain way. I'm not saying that they're deliberately spreading lies, but definitely creating a very biased, highly biased image.
I don't think that those news organizations are the only ones that do that. I think the mainstream media does that in the United States and around the world. Everybody has their own perspective. And one of the things that I talk about is manufacturing consent, Noam Chomsky's thesis that shows how mainstream media also propagates fake news and leaves out a whole bunch of information and bias in their reporting and news framing as well.
Right, in their interpretations. Now, with regards to its distribution, fake news is most often disseminated through social media, such as Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. According to a recent study in the US, it's been found that fake news stories are circulated at a faster rate compared to factual, real news information. What is it about fake news that make it go around faster than real news?
I think fake news kind of appeals to our kind of carnal desire to hear gossip.
Sure.
And I think that, in an age of social media, shareability matters the most. And so if you want your story to spread, it inherently has to be something that people want to tell other people about. And that's why fake news really appeals to the masses, because the people who create it, I'm talking about the people who are, in for-profit fake news models, they're 100% trying to get traffic. So they know how to write a headline or how to make a story that's just outrageous to the public.
Both in terms of clickbait titles and also the content. It's probably sensational and, as you said, appeals to the carnal desires. Social media platforms are also making an effort to cut down on this fake news. Facebook, the world's largest social media platform with over 2 billion users, has recently declared war on fake news.
But it's clear now that we didn't do enough to prevent these tools from being used for harm as well. We have to go through all of our relationship with people and make sure that we're taking a broad enough view of our responsibility.
And it's not just Facebook. Other social media platforms such as Twitter and YouTube are also feeling a growing sense of responsibility over the distribution of fake news on their platforms. Frank, to what extent should social media platforms shoulder some of the responsibility for fake news being distributed on their platforms?
I think this is a really tough question. It's a question of how you define the service of that platform. If it's just a device of private communication, that private communication should be maintained private. If you define the platform as the host, as a news organization, then they do have some responsibility here. We also need to look at the effects of this as well, I think. And also when you look at the size and impact of these different social media platforms, actually Facebook just said they were going to employ 10,000 people to fact check, to try to prevent this from happening. When you look at that, that's a medium-sized army. When you look at that number of people, you understand the scope of the problem and, their capability to do something about it.
Right. Then what about the fact that end-user personal information collected by the platforms, they're used to target some of these fake news and advertisement? Does that make the responsibility bigger for the platforms?
Absolutely. I think as someone who used to work as a social media editor, I see how paid clicks can make a big difference. And certainly Facebook especially is responsible for some of the fake news that's out there, because all you have to do is drop $10 and you can reach a few thousand people.
Right.
I mean, they earn very well through the generated traffic, and I think Facebook, they basically always said, we are not responsible for the content. I think it's long overdue that they are taking some actions. In Germany, for example, in January there was a new law introduced that any social media platform with over 2 million users, so basically, of course, all the big ones, Facebook, they can be held responsible for the content, and they can be fined up to 50 million euros.
Right. Now, so we all agree that social media platforms should, to a certain extent, be responsible for fake news on their platforms. But some critics fear that doing so could also infringe upon our freedoms of speech and expression. Do you worry that these legal countermeasures against fake news can indeed infringe upon free speech?
I think, I do worry about that, but I think that there needs to be clear definitions developed of what so-called fake news is right now. As we've just talked about, there's news bias in all news organizations. Is there going to be a crackdown on them where you have to meet certain standards of objectivity in your news reporting? Then you run into Big Brother overlooking the shoulder of every journalist and determining what is bias and what is not bias. And this is going beyond the facts. It's going toward the selection of the information that a reporter puts into reports. So I think, I worry that it is a slippery slope, but I think that, developing a definition of what fake news is perhaps the most important step, and then moving to implement measures consistently across the board that can define that and eliminate that from mass social networking spread would be a good thing.
Right, defining it and making that definition public to the end users would go a long way. All right, and when it comes to distinguishing fake news from real news, many people are quite confident in their ability to do so, but recent test results show that may not be the case. What are some ways for ordinary consumers of news to distinguish real from wrong?
Well, I think, the number one thing to do, and I see this mistake all the time, is when you're on Facebook or Twitter, really look at the URL before you click. Part of the problem with fake news is that when these things are put on social media, they all kind of look the same, at least before you click in. So you don't really know if it's CNN or like a fake website like CNN.co, unless you study that really tiny light gray line in the corner. So I think that's the biggest thing. It stops me from clicking on stuff all the time and wasting my time. But once you're in the actual story, if it's something that seems a little ridiculous or unbelievable, it doesn't hurt to do a Google News search to see if you see that story elsewhere, especially in publications that you really trust.
So see if they're verified by other sources of media and also the URL.
I think people know. I think when people click on it, it's infotainment at that point, and they know what they're doing, and they know that they're enclosed in that media bubble, and that they're on their way to work, and they just want some type of distraction. I think the amount of media that's being produced that people act on in terms of their daily lives, who they might vote for, that's kind of limited. Most news I think people consume is really a kind of infotainment, and I'm a little bit ashamed to say, and that they know that they're in that media bubble. If we look at a website like InfoWars, they have like 1 million people that go to their website. That's out of 400 million in the United States. 1 million's a lot of people, but it's not the number that's, I think, that outrageous and would cause, a real alarming concern, but still some concern, certainly. And I think that the consumers of that website and that news producer understand that they're in that kind of media bubble.
I would disagree. I think if you grow up and consume your news only on social media, sometimes it's hard, especially if you're very young. And I think in high schools, just as we learn the alphabet or Hangul, we should also learn the media language. There should be some class called media literacy or so, and then we should learn how news is produced and some basic facts. And especially South Korean users have a really hard time to see the news, because if you consume news on Naver, mostly you read the news on the platform, and the source of the newspaper or the online outlet is only mentioned relatively, at the end, relatively little. They don't really check it that much.
I actually think it's a little bit of what both of you said. I do think that there are people who literally don't know better and who just click on things and read them, and if they look like they're on a beautiful website, or in the case of InfoWars, like a great production value in the video, they just believe it.
Right.
I also think that there are people who definitely just want to believe things even though they're skeptical. And as anecdotal evidence, I have seen people who say that they watch InfoWars and they don't believe it, but it's interesting. And then over time, of course, they start to wonder if some of these things might be true. And just as another example, I saw a viral video a little while ago because it was the anniversary of the September 11th attacks in the United States. And it was a story about a dog this supposedly was so intelligent that it went in and saved, hundreds of lives, and it kept going back in, and unfortunately it perished in the fire. And I actually approached someone and said, this isn't true, and you shared it, and here's a link to a fact checker.
Right.
And they said, well, I want it to be true,
Yeah.
so, you know what I mean? So I think that there are people who definitely do propagate fake news because, quite frankly, it's entertaining. Yeah.
That's a post-truth era we live
Yeah,
in.
post-truth
Yeah.
era, definitely. Now, with the existing boundary between journalism and social media becoming increasingly blurred, have you seen some novel ways in which traditional media have used social media to their benefit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Instagram Live and Facebook Live is a great example of reaching younger audiences.
Sure.
I think what news organizations have done in the past with Snapchat is very exciting, keeping people, in the age 10 to 15 demographic informed. But also news organizations these days, because there are so many channels of reaching people, I honestly see social media as an opportunity to see news through people we know. Just as an example, the Me Too movement, right? How many people would necessarily be invested in that if they weren't getting social media posts from women around them sharing this news and adding their own spin on it, or in some cases their own story. So although I do think that there's a serious echo chamber or bubble problem, I do think also that there's no one, who's going to tell you to read something, more effectively than your friends. And social media enables people to do that.
Your friends and the people that you idolize and look up to for the younger generation, right? Following the stars that you idolize. Now, if we have a look at some numbers, according to a survey conducted by the Korea Press Foundation back in 2015, 1 out of 4 respondents said print newspapers would completely disappear within the next decade. In addition, back in February of this year, Mark Thompson, the CEO of the New York Times, said print journalism in the US has only about 10 years of life remaining. Can traditional mediums like newspapers and radio and TV news survive in this digital age?
Well, given that you have much more qualified experts saying no, I would tend to agree that newspapers are going to see a big change in how they're produced, and they need to really streamline their operations. If we look at that, the reason that's happening is because advertisers can reach many more very much better defined eyeballs through online. So I thought, looking back at this, I think newspapers were lucky to have survived for the 50 or 70 or 80 years that they did, given the fact that those eyeballs aren't worth what they were paying, as we've seen with the internet.
Right.
Well, actually, the newspaper that I work for regularly, called Die Tageszeitung, they recently announced that they will not invest anymore in their print newspaper.
Oh, okay.
But I think the media itself will not disappear, just the importance and the position will change drastically, and it will be more like a luxurious good, like something that people also read to show some kind of status or to basically have their coffee and breakfast and then read a newspaper, but it will not be their main news source anymore.
Okay. Now, Fabian, you mentioned before that anyone can become a reporter these days. Then what will become the distinguishing feature between a citizen journalist and a professional journalist?
I think it's the handcraft, the craft work, basically the professional skills that you learn as a journalist, which include, don't believe everything, and there are no easy truths, fact check everything. Even if you like some social movements, don't be an activist, at least have some distance. Those principles probably a normal citizen would not really respect, I think.
Okay. Now, what can we do? What are some ways that we can maximize the benefits of social media while minimizing the side effects that come with it?
As a news organization, I certainly think that we need to keep working on how to monetize our posts online so that we can keep fueling staff members into, promoting our work, but also making sure that, our work isn't suppressed by, competing with fake news. I think on the social media front, social media organizations really need to hire staffs to fact check and get rid of really, really radical, often hateful fake news. And I think as individuals, what we can do is just simply, learn about how we can distinguish fake news from real news and, be critical readers for sure.
Right. You mentioned media literacy before. Many countries are, they actually do have programs for students to increase their media literacy. Do you have any final comments, Fabian?
Well, I don't have really a big solution for that. It's highly complex, but for me personally, I will maximize the benefit of social media in the future by going more live, basically doing live broadcasting on Facebook and sharing my reporting more closely with my readers.
Have you done that before?
Yes.
Oh, you have. Okay. And Frank?
Well, I'm going to have to, re-up, I think, in my understanding of social media and how it might work for my own career.
All right, we'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for your input. Walter Cronkite, a legendary broadcast journalist, had this to say about responsible journalism. In seeking truth, you have to get both sides of the story, a lesson which still applies in the digital age and a cautionary note for those who formulate their views of the world through the lens of social media. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for tuning in and goodbye.